Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. I'm Stephen Pitti, Professor of History, American Studies, and Ethnicity, Race, and Migration. And I'm also the director of the Yale Center for the Study of Race, Indigeneity, and Transnational Migration. It's wonderful to see so many people here today with us for this exciting conversation. We're happy to host this conversation about the first English language translation of Severo Sarduy's poems, keeping in mind, of course, that in talking about this exiled Cuban author, those of us in New Haven are doing so on the historical and contemporary homelands of many indigenous people and nations, including the Mohegan, Mashantucket Pequot, Eastern Pequot, Schaghticoke, Golden Hill Pagasit, Niantic, Quinnipiac, and others. Our conversation today features translator David Francis, who serves as Dean of Grace Hopper College here at Yale University, where he also teaches in the program in Ethnicity, Race, and Migration. David's translations and poems have appeared in Inventory, the FSG book of 20th century Latin American poetry, Guernica, Exchanges, the Brooklyn Rail, Poetry Daily, the Chronicle of Higher Education, and elsewhere. Professor Francis holds an MFA in poetry writing from Columbia University and a PhD in Romance languages and literatures from Harvard University. He received a Fulbright to translate the poetry of Colombian writer Jose Asuncion Silva into English. And he's currently translating a collection of poems by the Cuban author Jorge Olivera Castillo and another by poets from northern Mexico. As I already mentioned briefly, his translation of Severo Sarduy's poetry, Footwork, just published in 2021 by Circumference Books, is the first collection of the Cuban author's poems translated into English. David Francis will be in conversation today with Shawn McDaniel, a terrific scholar who is currently assistant professor of American Studies and Ethnicity at the University of Southern California. Intersecting Caribbean, Latin American, and Latinx literary and cultural studies and an intellectual history, Professor McDaniel's research explores race, gender, sexuality, aesthetics, modernism, and dissidence in print, visual, and sonic cultures of the Americas. His first book, Centenary Subjects, Race, Reason, and Rupture in the Americas, is forthcoming later this year from Vanderbilt University Press. Professor McDaniel is working on a second book entitled Cuban Chic, Queer Deco and Diasporic Modernism in New York, which examines the literary, graphic, sartorial, sonic, and cinematic cultures of interstitial Cubanidad in New York, as well as its inter-American routes through Havana, Santiago de Cuba, Merida, Veracruz, and Los Angeles. We in the RITM Center feel very honored to be able to host this celebration of David Francis's translation of Sarduy's poems. Let me thank the Associate Director of Yale's RITM Center, Matthew Tanico, for his hard work putting our event together, as well as center staff, Maggie Katz and Nicole Edwards, and of course, a great big thanks to the Whitney Humanities Center for co-sponsoring this event. Now, let me encourage all of you who are here today to submit your questions to Professor Francis and Professor McDaniel by using the Q&A function here on Zoom, which is a great way to be in conversation with them. I know that they would love to hear your questions about Sarduy, about Cuban authors and other writers, about translation, and about other relevant topics that come up for you during the course of this conversation. So please do use the Q&A function to submit questions to them. And we're really happy to say that Circumference Books, the publisher of Sarduy's Footwork, has offered a discount off for today's attendees who'd be interested in purchasing that book, as I hope all of you are. The discount code from Circumference Books for this publication is going to be posted in the chat. If you know people who'd be interested in this event, but who aren't here today, who can't make it for this conversation, please do let them know that this recording will be on the Yale YouTube site on the RITM playlist in the weeks to come, and that they can find it there. And with that, I want to thank all of you for joining us today. And I want to turn the microphone over with great joy to Professor David Francis and Professor Shawn McDaniel. Thank you.
Thank you, Steve. And I'm just so elated to be here for the first public celebration of this book. And I have so much gratitude to you, to Matthew Tanico, to Shawn McDaniel, the Whitney Humanities Center, and RITM for supporting this event. So thank you very much. I want to start with a brief introduction to who Sarduy is, reading from the first page of the book. And then what I'll do is give a sort of panorama of the poems that I translated from the beginning of the work to the end. And that should take about 20 minutes. And then I really can't wait to discuss the poems and questions that everyone has about the translations, about Sarduy, about the book afterward with Shawn. So that will be coming soon. The scarred body or the image of its absence. Faced with the question of how to translate the body of Sarduy's poetry, I feel a sense of stuttering. How to convey the enormity of seeming contradiction I encountered while translating his poems, indeed a body of work that sings on its own, that celebrates the carnal life, the sensual experiences of dance, of painting, food, music, and sexual pleasure, but that also recognizes in these pleasures the imminence of one's passing. In his 56 years of life, the exiled poet, novelist, essayist, painter, and world traveler managed to include such a vast range of perspectives and forms in his texts that in the process of selecting which poems to include in Footwork, I wanted to offer a survey of his life as a poet, from his earlier pieces to those he composed near the end of his life. Severo Sarduy was not known to follow convention, nor did he think that conventional approaches to storytelling or lyrical composition could capture the complexities of human behavior or personal and national identity. The publication of his major works followed the Cuban Revolution and the political turmoil that would ensue with Fidel Castro's rise and Cuban dictator Fulgencio Batista's loss of power in 1958. As boom literature, galvanized by such authors as Mario Vargas Llosa, Julio Cortázar, and Carlos Fuentes, brought Latin America increasing visibility in the world literary stage. This gay author and artist, son of a railroad worker, redefined Latin American approaches to the writing of literature from the vantage point of his exile in France and from many other parts of the world he visited after departing his country of birth. Born in 1937 in Camagüey, Cuba, Sarduy started writing as a young man, publishing in his teenage years in various Cuban literary magazines between Camagüey and Havana. After pursuing studies in medicine in Cuba's capital, he left the island on a scholarship in 1960 to study art criticism in Europe, traveling to Madrid and then to Paris. Aware of Castro's efforts to police homosexuality and re-educate gay men in work camps called military units to aid production, the writer would reside for the rest of his life in Paris, never to return home. Sarduy achieved considerable notoriety before his life was cut short in 1993 due to complications with AIDS. The author's first novel, Gestos, Gestures, was published in 1963. But the book by which he is most recognized is De Donde Son los Cantantes, published in 1967, an experimental work of fiction that Suzanne Gilles Levine translated deftly into English as From Cuba with a Song in 1972. Internationally celebrated for his work, Sarduy won France's prestigious Médicis Prize for his novel Cobra, which came out in 1972. Indeed, critics have published extensively on his novels and essays and continue to write about his poetry. Sarduy's works contain an often chaotic convergence of linguistic registers and characters, whose bodies, just in drag, tattooed or scarred, distort, reconfigure, or explode in Big Bang fashion or in little deaths, bourgeois efforts to codify or define a singular Latin American identity. In what ensues, I wish to share a series of poems from his earliest works to those he wrote near the end of his life. In doing so, and in preparation for my conversation with Professor McDaniel, I hope to illustrate not only some of Sarduy's masterful formal renderings, but also the expansiveness with which he wrote into his works vast geographies of art, philosophy, science, desire, and ruminations on death and the life of writing. Now I think I will be sharing a visualization of the poems I will be reading, just so that everyone can get a sense not only of the language that Sarduy is using, but also the brilliant ways in which he plays with form on the page, which is much more difficult to convey just by reading his poems out loud. So I'll begin with a poem called Sevillanas. It's from an earlier chapbook titled Flamenco. It's his first chapbook that came out in 1969, but was republished in Sarduy's book called Big Bang in 1974. And there's a series of poems in this book dedicated to different forms of flamenco dance. So this form of dance that we'll be reading about here is called Sevillanas. Sevillanas. In the white space, where shadows are annulled, light goes gnawing at the borders, folding the colors, destroying the forms. In the white space, crossing over from the other side of the band of light, bursting in without limits, without shadows. Sphere, yellow rectangle, green stains, triangle, convergence of the iris, pieces whose marble is hardly visible are drawn. Are won over once more by the light, decomposed, expelled from the page, disjointed figure, extinguished that, in the white space, an instant later goes insinuating its forms, creating fringes of color, defining their borders, appearing while the excessive light withdraws. A head, a squared saffron, blue and green ovals, a prism, a segmented body, white. So I will move forward to another chapbook that came out originally in 1970, Mood Indigo, which follows Duke Ellington's eponymous album called Mood Indigo, and read a poem within that book. It's also published in the publication of Big Bang, but this poem is called Echoes of Harlem. Echoes of Harlem. Black panthers with shut shutters, with planks studding doors, with bags of sand and broken mirrors, and amulets blocking windows, incantations murder white, Jean Genet in a forgotten suitcase, machine guns, everything must be broken, echoes of striped Harlem, cyclone, little hash cakes, zero, Nina at the piano. Everything must be destroyed. The next time, fire. So as we move forward, I won't be reading this poem, but just to offer, again, another sense of how much Sarduy in his earlier works is playing with form. I show you here a poem called Mood Indigo, and it's taking the shape of a spiral and referring to a number of musical venues and in the history of jazz music played in different venues transatlantically. But I would like to move on to the next poem that comes from Big Bang, which is essentially about Sarduy's obsessive thought about the theory of the Big Bang as the creation of the universe, but also as sort of this figure standing in for erotic desire, for the encounter of two lovers, and many other things. So much of Sarduy's celestial knowledge is encapsulated in these beautiful poems about celestial bodies, and heavenly body is another term that could be used to discuss one of these ideas. Heavenly body. The weight of your body on my body, suturing skin, ciphered, green saliva on your back, spine on spine, knees knotted, smeared with phosphorescent lacquer, the bones light up the black-walled room, volumes articulating son boiton, entering in silence, greased, slowly, each and another, radiance descending over the wall, along the distance of the wall, dead asters falling to the sheets marble. And so this poem concludes the translation of Big Bang and really much of Sarduy's experimental work with form, but it doesn't conclude his brilliant renderings of new sorts of language that goes into very traditional form. And in A Fleeting and Masked Witness, which came out in 1985, we see a series of really beautiful sonnets, heavily evocative of homoerotic desire and sex. And so one of these poems I'd like to read, they're all untitled, but opening up with this book is one of these beautiful sonnets with the first line called "The Murmur of Machines Was Growing." The murmur of machines was growing in the adjacent room. Already my hope for an adjective before your body was nothing more than an attempt to shorten the day. The night was arriving and preceding the desert wind. The certain light where your naked feet on the mat of sunset was suspending time. I do not remember love, only desire, not the lack of faith, only the sphere. The image facing its reflection with white texture, the true page, or your body, which I still reread, vast ideogram of spring. Another example of Sarduy's obsessive work with not only the sonnet form, but with sound is this subsequent sonnet. Not the voice preceded by the echo, nor the ravenous reflection of the naked bodies and the quicksilver of the quiet crystals, but the simple brushstroke, dry. The fruits on the table in the colonial landscape. When the hour of the siesta enveloped us in the density of its swelling seas, or in the murmur of its ended fiesta, when one and the other extinguished thirst, when light advanced through the orchard that the flame tree reddened, we opened then the great door to the insular murmur of noon and to the timely still light. The final sonnet I'll be reading from this section. Pull out of me more than what was left out. For when reaching and defining aporia, a planet on the other side of its day ignites in the night of its senses. Not by force, for the humid temple of Venus II does not take pleasure in being wounded by the Berninian arrow or by frenzy. Someday you will lay lubricants or natural substances between the borders with cunning prudence, or with salivated caution, that might ease the burning of your entrance. Because with love and with ardor and the annals of history, our nuptials are ciphered. Nearing the end of Sarduy's life, we see another publication of sonnets, which I've translated as the title is A Perennial and Betrayed Witness. It comes out in 1993, but I'd like to focus in this section of the reading for the conversation on Sarduy's brilliant work with decimas, which, different from the sonnet, is an even more compact form of 10 lines and a very strict rhyme, which was not reproducible in the Spanish, but in my work in rendering these decimas into English, I did do my best to convey the sense of compactness and musicality. So the first series of decimas comes from a series of of poems called A Crown of Fruits. Cherimoya. Who hasn't tried a cherimoya in the shade of a red manjack tree? Danae weaves and undoes time and gold and rum, sickly sweet and sugary for the inexperienced tongue. Neither green nor ripe, the palate takes delight. Fruit, no, pulp of the fruit. Pleasure, but pleasure standing still. I'd like to read now Decima number 4 called Pineapple. I placed a bald pineapple on these Chinese oranges and added in the corners the sweetest guava. In this way, in exile, the insular queen crowns Baroque her still life, little, and death which I've offered her, and the emblem that it evokes, there will be no pain, no more pain or oblivion. And finally, from the series, Cashew. However you close the mouth, the tasty cashew, acidic and then sweet, turns your palate upside down. If you spill its juice is a little matter, a sudden idle drama, a light fright, when its red hangs higher than the hummingbird, than fire. So the last decima that I'd like to read from a different series of decimas comes from a series dedicated to orishas, which Sarduy has dedicated to Jorge and Miguel Barnett, to the orishas in Cuba. It's the book written by Natalia Bolivar Arstegui, and of course to Lidia Cabrera and Pierre Verginet. I will be reading from this series, the final one, titled Yemoja. Mother of water, new moon, a dove, a lamb, I will offer to the austere sea that I might pass this test. With life comes death, a cross of white cascarilla over the yellow forehead. You will write my final breath, and against tide and wind I'll row until I reach the other shore. Following Sarduy's death came the publication in 1999 of his Obras Completas, his complete works. And this is one of the most brilliant poems, I think, in his work, particularly due to what he does with the form. And as you read and hear the poem in English, you'll notice that this poem, which is dedicated to the letters of the alphabet, actually follows the letters of the alphabet from A to Z. Each line begins with that letter and also ends with that letter, but in subsequent, in a series that follows each other. So I will read this beautiful poem in English as well. To the letters of the alphabet, ardent letter, your blood will be ephemera, brief like flowers of the baobab, creating words that other letters, sick, drop from, a ruse blundered. Elsewhere, writing was in another empire, fragment, crib, knot, raga, and kip. Grave thunder of a golden gong, hint and reflection of an ancient aleph, image that the space gives of its own eye. Joining together letters, sun, and Hajj, Kafka finds himself with his devil, K, like a daisical writing of a rumor that's lethal. Yano filled, combined in the words of lull. Mallarmé doesn't forget this, nor does Islam, nor the monk who taught in the monsoon, or he who wrote with letters and prayed, oh, Pietnet Mondrian paints listening to bebop. Question, who is Duchamp and who? Reflected in the trivial and the stellar. Signs, silences, do we not see the shadow? Or is there indeed all the being of light, as in Rembrandt? Universe of letters where you painted cities, Tel Aviv, Westminster by Monet, the grey Glasgow, xylography of the crude stacks. Yet here's his signature, Severo Sarduy, zagging, left-handed algorithm of stubborn blitz. Geneva, 8, 8, 88. So the final poems I'd like to read come from a time when Sarduy was well aware of his own imminent passing in writing epitaphs, both to himself, about himself, but about his friends as well, who are also dying of AIDS. Epitaphs. 1. Here lies death and severe, he who used so many shoes soles, whose hips he abused, from the front and from behind, laconic adagio and soothsayer, inscribe on his tomb, the skeleton crumbles, gold of jewels undone. His name, and between two dates, the dead man's out to dance. 5. Death, you are so lazy in delivering your sentence. Here rests your witness. It astonishes and even delights to see you labor, to see you scarce, to see your disappearance with the pleasure of surrender, your siege of ash pounding the funny vertebrae. That's your way of being. 6. Savage like the lashing of rags and putrefaction, death's violent gob of spit. There's no embrace worth faithful or long-term, two dates as shroud of dry and brief design, my confession and abomination, jewel, colophon, and emblem of the Baroque funeral. 6. At my funeral, may there be cheese and guava and music. May the mortuary protocols be abridged and limited, no excessive lamenting, no Bach, light music. Play La Sonora Matancera, for good taste, colors. Don't lay flowers on me if on the highway I die. I realize there's some numbering issues here in this edition. This was 6 and the final one was 7. But that ends the reading, and now I'll stop sharing the screen, and I welcome conversation and questions about these poems, the process of translating them, and anything else as well.
Great, thank you so much, David. Thank you. I'll just be brief and say thank you to the organizers of this event. Thanks for the invitation. To all the sponsors, we really appreciate it. And thanks most of all, of course, you to the public for being here via Zoom. We wish we could celebrate this in person, of course, but this is, we're working with what we got. So it's a real pleasure to be here with all of you. And I'll just get started. I will also encourage you to submit questions you have in the chat. We'll get to those. We'll leave plenty of time for the Q&A. We have such a good showing here today, which we appreciate, and also see a lot of people in the know who work on Sarduy, who have made important contributions to Sarduy scholarship, etc. So we look forward to your questions as well. I guess I could just get started off kind of in a general sense, Dave, if you could just kind of tell us a little bit, what possesses somebody to translate Sarduy. You were talking about sort of this obsession or this obsessive method that he had with sort of revisiting, the sonnet and these different things. Well, I would imagine that kind of obsession probably also falls on the shoulder of a translator of Sarduy as well. So if you could maybe just tell us kind of what got you started down this path.
Thank you, Shawn. I fell in love with Sarduy's poems from the beginning. From the first moment I encountered them, I found a small edition of poems, also published in the 80s, called Daiquiri. I was a master's program in Spanish at the University of Virginia, and Daiquiri contributed also to the 1985 publication that I just was reading from. And there's these brilliantly complex sonnets, and I thought, oh, I know the sonnet form. I love that anyway, and I thought it would be super accessible when I was, this is my first encounter with his poems, yeah. And I found very quickly that was absolutely not the case. But something about his ability to infuse language with so many things happening at once was really compelling to me. Daiquiri is composed of only 8 sonnets, but they're all extremely homoerotic and all at the same time very subtle in some ways and very outrageous and hilarious in other ways. So I just became obsessed from the beginning, and I had to read more, and then, but I stayed with the sonnets initially, and then I found these other brilliant formal renderings that I thought would be important to share with his work too. He never stuck with only one form. He was experimenting throughout his life with how language could convey some of his central obsessions, but in different ways on the page and vocally. So I thought this was something that had to be shared, primarily because so much emphasis is on his novels, but there should be greater attention to his poetry as well.
Yeah, I mean, it's this formal, this aesthetic experimentalism that defines a lot of his work, and the fact that there's so many, as you said, this plethora of expressive modes and registers, repertoires that coexist in all of his work, and thinking about how meaning is so embedded in the language itself. Can you share with us sort of how you approach these linguistic points of contact, or maybe these dissonances is probably a better way to frame the question as opposed to points of contact? I think that's something that would be really interesting to people, because I know that's something that was on my mind when I had heard that you had translated Sarduy. I immediately had a bunch of questions of like, what are the exigencies? What are the logistics of doing so? What are the high points, the low points, the challenges? I think if you could walk us through some of that, I think the people will be really interested in hearing about that.
Oh, that's a great question. The dissonances were wonderful and maddening at the same time. So an example would be the poem whose first line is "Pull out of me more." It's not like that exactly in Spanish. There's a pun going on in that first line that is both a pun beckoning the other towards some sort of physical encounter, but at the same time distancing him or herself from that other person. But you don't see that in the formal writing of the verse alone. You have to read the first line out loud, and you hear within that first line there's a pun being articulated. Omíteme la más, to stay away from me, and also méteme la más, and there's an invitation to sexual encounter. So this was something I had to hear out loud, and one of my first conversations about this poem was with a brilliant scholar, Gustavo Pellón, who I was working with in a translation workshop, with whom I discussed this problem. And I think I spent way too many years trying to find a line that would work, and finally decided that there was obviously no perfect line in the English that would do what Sarduy was doing. At the same time, I in all of my workings with the sonnets especially, but also the decimas, I attempted at least to infuse the poem still with some sort of English version of the sexual innuendo, but also with rhyme, music, etc., so that you can get a sense of this sense of play also in the English.
Yeah, it seems like a tall order, right? I mean, it seems like a very not only delicate process, a maddening one, an obsessive one, but a tall one at the same time, right? So I mean, I'm wondering, when I talk about Sarduy, I always end up with this kind of loop. There's always this sort of circularity going on with me, where I'm trying to kind of talk about all the topics that he's broaching within a short span. And so, I mean, how, considering this vast array of, again, repertoires, registers, that spans sort of this cosmic erudition, if we think of Big Bang or the whole black hole, but also at the same time, these sort of very deeply intimate realms of the poetic subject. Can you share your thoughts about how you navigate kind of the mundane and the metaphysical at the same time in his poetry?
Right. But I think that it takes a long time with his work to sort of try to figure out what he's doing. So both to read a lot of his poems and read all of them and get a sense of his more global obsessions, but also to get a sense of how in each poem he's playing with the reader. So if we were to go back to that same sonnet, pull out of me more. I initially became so obsessed with that first line that I neglected to pay attention to the broader philosophical aporia, which comes up in the second line, which is pointing to a tension between two distinct ways of viewing the same thing. It became apparent to me that the sonnet was not only a very funny sonnet, but an invitation and instructions to the reader to go into the poem deeply and to extract meaning from it from different perspectives. So pull out of me more was what I finally landed on, because I realized that much of Sarduy's poems were instructions to me as a reader and as a translator to understand this philosophical dissonance between life and death, between being and non-being, between physical encounter and the metaphysical sentiment behind desire, and how at the end of one's life, which is what I think you see at this sort of like experience of orgasm, right? This big bang or little death at the end of the poem. There's this realization of one's imminent passing, and that at least if there's a sense of encounter between two people that is sealed with the nuptials of desire and love, that's where one's history can be written. So I don't know if that's a direct answer to your question, but I found in Sarduy's poems both maddeningly difficult complexities, but also a deeper philosophical troubling of one's existence, and the fact that one's identity can never be fully defined except through dissonance and through this philosophical complications that can never be resolved, but still can be pointed to through language and through music. So my work was really to find ways to celebrate that language through Sarduy's music and trying to do that in English.
Definitely. I'm hearing the last thing you were saying. I'm wondering how much the title you've selected for this collection, Footwork, applies not only to Sarduy's poetry, but your translations of them as well. Can you kind of just talk us through that title a little bit?
Yeah, so the title is really hard. None of the individual titles of his books seemed appropriate for the full collection of his works, and so many of his sonnets were untitled, so they lacked sort of names to sort of enter into. We just sort of began reading them, and so I was going back to his earlier works, which I think have received the least amount of attention, and noticed that there was so much emphasis on dance, and then noticed that this sort of permeated, not only all the many different references to types of dance in flamenco, zapateado and sevillanas and other forms of dance, but it was what came out in his final epitaphs, the one whose shoes soles were worn thin because there was so much dancing in his life. So I thought, why not something referential to feet, to feet that are not only sort of the feet that are dancing, but also the sort of formal renderings that he was taking up in so many of his poems through decasyllabic verse, through decimas, and really honor sort of his work with the form of the body and with the feet that create his lines.
Wow, that's great. Thank you. Thanks for sharing those thoughts and just the idea of music, or dance, the somatic movements, musicality, theatricality, all of these things converge in his work, of course. But I'm wondering, sort of one of the most compelling parts, I think, has to do with jazz, which you read, or you showed us one of the formal poems, right? And I'm just wondering, how are you thinking moving forward about music in Sarduy's poetry? I mean, particularly with respect to like the poems about Harlem and jazz, and like Espiral Negra is one of the poems you put up, right? Mood Indigo. I'm just wondering sort of how you read that larger sort of transnational, conversation that's happening around Black aesthetics. Mm-hmm. And sort of the work that he's done in his prose, for example, and in his poetry as well, about Afro-Cuban culture. I'm just kind of wondering how you read sort of transnationally those elements in his poetry.
Right, and I really love that question, because there has been some scholarship on it, but I would love, through these translations, to bring greater attention to Sarduy's earlier sort of obsessive work with music through poetry, and also his attention given to race. From Cuba with a Song is that classic novel that those who study Cuban literature will go back to talk about Sarduy's own and Cuba's origins of the African slave trade, but also Chinese labor, but also the history of Spain in Cuba on the island. And that novel really does a lot of good work to point to those concerns. But what Sarduy's doing in Mood Indigo is bringing greater attention to musical forms as they travel from one geographic location to another. So what's really interesting about Mood Indigo and Espiral Negra is the gaps in knowledge that you can't see as easily in the prose, right? So he's actually using the form of the poem to show these geographic leaps that music has managed to transcend between different musical venues, Paris, New York, and then create at the same time white space around which history and narrative can't be read. So as much as Sarduy is writing about the history of musical form, he's also writing about how that history, through sort of violent eruptions in form, can never be fully accessed, which is one of the reasons I couldn't really read it at a reading. You have to appreciate it on the page.
Definitely, yeah, and just kind of piggybacking off that, what do you know about sort of Sarduy's practice of like reciting the poems that he wrote, or what kind of spaces did they exist in, public, private? I don't know if you have any information or details about that.
That's a great question. There are some interviews of him online where he honors the history of sound and music, and he was he would recite his decimas brilliantly. But I actually I haven't been able to find any of his readings, and I don't know of him going to venues and giving like poetry readings. If someone in the audience does, I would love to hear about that. Sure. But I think that's a really great question. Mm-hmm. So much of his sort of the criticism on him is dedicated to the novels, but
absolutely, yeah, absolutely. And going off that as well, this is another reason why the intervention you're making is so important. Is that it brings other kinds of readings to Sarduy. It opens Sarduy up to different kinds of audiences. But there's also something, like you said, this sort of inevitable gesture to go back to the prose, or the predominance of the prose, right, of his prose versus the poetry. And so I think, something I was very interested in learning about, because I know Sarduy's prose much better than I know his poetry, and the same case could be made about other Cuban writers as well, Reinaldo Arenas, for example. How do you situate Sarduy's poetry within the landscape of Latin American poetry? What are some other poets that he's sort of engaging with, riffing off of? Or how can you read him in the context with respect of other Latin American poets? Because I see the formal experimentalism, I was thinking like Nicanor Parra, right? Like this anti-poetic kind of praxis. And I was just wondering if you kind of would use that paradigm or how you would sort of think through his poetry in a larger context?
Yeah, I love that question because he does play with form on the page, and so does Nicanor Parra. But at the same time, as you sort of enter into the sonnets, you get a sense of his deeply embedded devotion to the Baroque and to writers like Reinaldo Arenas, but also to Spanish Baroque poets like Quevedo and and which is why his sonnets are so complicated, because he's at one time using this really high register of rhetoric where one noun is connected to a verb like in the next stanza, and you're supposed to figure out what the sentence is meaning syntactically, and at the same time there's a low register pun going on there about a sexual encounter. So he is, obsessed with St. John of the Cross, with many of the Spanish Baroque poets, but also Reinaldo Arenas. Julian Casal, I think, is in the background there too, but also a Peruvian poet, Cesar Vallejo. When there's a poem about blows in life that is so reminiscent of one of Cesar Vallejo's famous poems that is also talking about blows of life. But when you read it in Sardui's poem, it's almost, you hear Cesar Vallejo, but you also hear like kind of a joke about like, making the blows of life not really something to worry about that much, because it's just one of those things that happens. And this particular poem I'm thinking about is a flawed sexual encounter that just goes bad, and it's like, oh well, that happens sometimes. And think about Cesar Vallejo in a different way now too. He's thinking of all these writers, and he's also working with the really canonical boom writers at the same time, right? He helps bring Cien Años de Soledad, 100 Years of Solitude, into French. So he's got all of these authors in mind as he's situating his own verse and novels in a much more international landscape.
Great, thank you. That helps, because that's again one of the really exciting parts about your contribution here, is that it's giving some more entry points in Sarduy's poetry, right? It's sort of propelling us, even those of us who do read Sarduy's prose, to maybe spend some more time and attention with his poetry. I have many, many more questions that I could talk to you about, but honestly, the chat is blowing up, and I think it would be really great to give some time to some people's questions. So I'll pick a few out to get us going here, and thank you to all of you for submitting questions. I don't know if you can see the chat function, David, but I'll read them out loud so everybody can hear it. Such incredible work, David. Could you say a bit about Sarduy's life in Paris? Was he influenced by French poets, Baudelaire, etc., or maybe in conversation with work by Césaire or Seigneur?
I love that question. He was very much embedded in French culture. His partner Francois was a philosopher, and they were partners very early on in his time in Europe until the end of Sarduy's life. And so in his time spent in Paris was very much embedded in post-structuralism and deconstruction. He worked with Telquel, and he knew Julia Kristeva. There's this really cool photo of him in conversation with Kristeva at a cafe, and if you've seen this photo, you know what I'm talking about. It's like Kristeva's in the center, but to the side, like looking in Sarduy's direction. And I think that's sort of like emblematic of this really interesting moment in French theory in Sarduy's in conversation with Roland Barthes at the same time, Foucault, Derrida, and in so much of his poetry is you can see this influenced by his sort of understanding that of the ways in which language only can provide a partial sort of understanding of oneself. So yeah, he's aware of all these French writers that this questioner is bringing up, but he's also sort of writing out the philosophy of deconstruction in his poems which adds another really frustrating complication to translating them and grounding them in the physical body that comes out in the font as well.
Well, let's keep those frustrations of translation going with this next question then, because from Emma says, I highly enjoyed To the Letter of the Alphabet. Since your translation is also an abecedarian, what was the experience of translating words from Spanish to English while confined to the same first letter? Were there any words you had to replace or translate them directly?
That was so hard, that poem. It was really fun too, and I think maybe I might have a problem. Like I loved the complication of not knowing how to make this work, but it was, Sarduy must have had so much fun writing that poem. Like just the date itself, 8/8/88. I don't think he might not have written it all on that same day, but it's there. So I enter the text with a sense of playfulness and devotion, more so, you're right, to the series of letters at the beginning of the poem, starting each line, but also at the end. So you when you read it, again, you will notice that there are some aberrations. And at the same time, I tried to sort of stick to more so to the form so that you could see this working in English. One of the aberrations that you'll see is I just couldn't get an O at the end of the line with the first word. The line begins with an O. What is that word? Here it is. I don't remember, but the last line you'll see, the last word is not the letter O, it's the word O. So, or he who wrote with letters and prayed. Oh, so if you can think of a word that like ends with O and would make sense in that line, give me a call and we'll talk about it. That would be really fun to think of another way of translating the poem, but it was really hard to make sense of that line, the word that ended in O. So I just thought of the action of praying, rather than trying to end the line with O, I did sort of like a homophonic joke to the sound O, as one might say when praying. So that's one of the aberrations that's there, but you're right to point that out. Also, in the English language, there's no like double L letter, but I couldn't extract that from the poem either. So it was kind of freeing in a way to add another letter to the English alphabet.
I love hearing about the methodology of translating in these desafíos. Next question is coming from Andy Alfonso, somebody who knows a thing or two about Sarduy. Also, aside from the experimental poetry that we've been talking about, are there more political poems that directly reference or allude to the context of the revolution that Sarduy somewhat escaped and that you briefly described in your intro to the talk?
That is a really great question. I'm thinking back to a poem that I didn't read, but it's called Havana Sextet, and it's a poem in 6 parts, and it's really sort of like this nostalgic piece about asking where did all of these things that were part of a previous Cuba go, and there are many cultural references in the poem that you just kind of have to know, and that you, if you don't know them, it makes the poems sort of initially less penetrable. But one of the references is to a trapeze artist called Chacumbele, and who tragically fell from he's walking across this tightrope, and this is a real guy, and he looks down at, well, so the myth goes, he looks down at this beautiful woman who he's in love with, and he sees her kiss someone else, and so he's distracted and he falls and his body's maimed, and he can never participate in this brilliant art at which he's so good again. He becomes, like a policeman. And so I had no idea what this word was at all until I just I had to Google it, and I wrote Roberto González Echevarria to ask, do you know anything about this cultural reference? And then he sent me a Cuban radio show about Chacumbele and the myth that his name encapsulates. And so just that one word sent me down like a rabbit hole of just being obsessed with what Sarduy's lines in his earlier poems were doing. And I think he really was thinking at the time, how can I write about this place that is just no longer the same, and sort of honor the musicality of Cuba and you know, these open fairs of circuses and dances and all of these things, and sort of ask where they've gone in the end. So yeah, I don't know if it's a direct political reference, but it's a nostalgia imbued poem about what has been lost from the history of Cuba.
Great, thank you for your question. Thanks for your answer, David. I'm going to go to Alexandra next. They say, I noticed Sarduy's frequent use of specific colors in his poems. I was also thinking something similar, the function of nouns, right? There was a lot has been written about the word plumas, right? And de donde son los cantantes, right? So I'm just wondering sort of what, along with Alexandra's question here, what kind of weight do these nouns that perhaps reappear, or presences like, you know, El Tria Matamoro, I'm just wondering how that kind of figures into your process, or if that, you know, how you read that in Sarduy's work. But for Alexandra's specific question, I noticed Sarduy's frequent use of specific colors in his poems, especially the color white. He seemed to like white for specific moods. To what do you attribute his use of particularly strong colors, for example, in his Blank Pages poems?
Alexandra, that's a great question. You probably know this, but Sarduy was also a painter, and he was obsessed with color. I believe there's one line in an interview of his where he says colors cure, and he was obsessed with sort of the meaning behind color, and which brought him also to his obsessive mystical thinking about the work of Rothko's paintings. And so that was very much part of his life too. He was a really, I think, a brilliant painter, and you can find his works in the Princeton Firestone archives, and go see them, and they're beautiful. So not only was he writing about colors, but he was painting these formal works that were often obsessed with circles, and in squares and ellipses and rectangles. And so there's a lot you can say about this, but one of the things that you can say is related to white space and black space. So if you see in the sort of like the black spiral, Sarduy is obsessed with a sense of negative space, of impenetrability, but also of death. So I believe some criticism by, again, Roberto González Echevarria points to the fact that in Yoruba, white means death. So there's this sense of history being imbued by the presence of death in Black Spiral and Mood Indigo. But if you look at other poems, you'll also see sort of a celebration of orange, of red, thinking again back to a sonnet about Rothko, and some other colors too. Many of the poems are about still lifes, right? Either directly or indirectly. So he's painting the life of a figure in a sonnet while it's also just still there. So what's beautiful about the translation of Spanish to English is that una naturaleza muerta becomes in English a still life. So the two poems juxtaposed to each other both are recognize the presence of death, but also the continuance of life through the preservation of color in paintings and in sonnets and poems.
Great, thank you. Thanks for the question. Thanks for sharing your thoughts. The next one I'll go to is from Shivangi. Really great question. While translating, did your life world and your own positionality impose or interfere in the way you interpreted and translated his work? And I think we can kind of piggyback off that question too, to just think about larger methodologies of translation. I think what is it about your own story, history that kind of perhaps drew you to Sarduy, and how does your own perspective sort of figure into the ways in which you translate that poetry?
Yeah, I think that's a really important and ethical question, right? That I have to consider when I'm thinking of how to render someone else's work into English. And so I think that's really central in the work of translation, and it's one of the questions that comes up I'm teaching a translation course this term, so yes, I think it sort of necessarily does restrict my ability to perfectly translate a piece of work in the way that it was written in the original language. So I think for one, I came to his works in a very sort of I guess a canonical training, right? I was reading about his works through the canon, and as I was getting my master's degree in Spanish at the University of Virginia. So immediately, my understanding of the works was sort of historicized, and understanding him already with a large amount of criticism behind him. But also, I was trying to place his works in conversation with lots of texts that I didn't know existed as in conversation with those poems. So I think both my education and my lack of sort of contemporary of the moments in which he was publishing the works from Paris, not really from a university system, but through in journals and these really in these publications that had really small prints. I wasn't reading them in the ways in which they were initially published, so I felt sort of constricted by that. And I'm not Cuban, so I felt limited initially by my understanding sometimes of Cuban idiom. So I shared poems with others who might have a different perspective, because I wanted to balance my limitations with sort of the perspectives and backgrounds and readerships of others who might have different, who might hear things differently, as I initially did when I was reading that first sonnet that I discussed. I'm sure I'll find even more really fruitful conversations about the ways in which Sarduy's poems can and should be read differently and translated differently. And I think that's what Sarduy would have wanted as well.
Yeah, and I think what's really useful about what you're sharing is it goes against the idea of translating between languages as like a dialectical process, right? It's really rather a lot comes to bear, right? And I think in the case of Sarduy's poetry, you are already counting on excellent translators of Sarduy's prose to be able to engage with, and a larger, obviously, community of scholars of Sarduy's work as well, right? So it's very interesting how all of those kind of points of contact have to be marshaled or deployed to be able to, approximate these translations, right?
Definitely, yeah.
I'm going to go to Adrian Adams. Thank you, Adrian, for your question. Could you speak more about how Sarduy's AIDS-related death shaped the posthumous circulation of his work within both Cuba and international circles? Which circles took up and or disregarded certain elements of his repertoire?
Wow, that's a great question. I think when I think about that question, the first text that comes to mind is Pájaros de la Playa, which came out soon after his death in 1993. Beach Birds, and it was translated by Susan Jill Levine, and I believe also Carol Meyer. And that text is really very much about it's about an unnamed island on which young men are dying premature, like an unnamed disease. And it's a beautiful book. It's much more, I would say the prose is much more, I don't know, accessible in a sense compared to his earlier works, but incredibly haunting at the same time. And it's impossible not to think of AIDS and also Cuba. And so I when I think of that question, I think very much about how Sarduy was conscious of the fact that he was about to die. Many of his writer friends had already died. Manuel Puig had died. Reynaldo Arenas had died. And he was trying to write the story of this imminent passing that had no resolution. And I really view this novel as a beautiful rendering of that inevitability, and also a tragic sort of telling of how he viewed his own departure from the world and as a writer. So I see that very much embedded in the novel, but also, as you can see in the epitaphs, I think they deserve a lot more attention, because it's obvious that he's talking about, he's writing into the epitaphs with the word Severo in Spanish, his own name, and it's sort of like honoring the fact that his name will be written into poems about someone's passing, someone who happens to be severe, and will be recognized through that. And at the same time, in a very sort of like in a fun, celebratory way, right? He's off to dance at the end of that poem. So yeah, that's how I see them. I wish the epitaphs were more read and more circulated, but maybe this will do some of that work.
Great, thank you. And thank you everybody for your questions. David, I guess just kind of before we wrap things up, is there something you'd like to share with us about, what would you like us to know about Sarduy's poetry or the poet? What should we leave here with, or some things that delight you, perhaps? I mean, I think that's something that came through in your translation, and the ways which you framed it was sort of, not just the severe aspects of his poetry, but rather this wit and humor and irony that was just, incredible. So I guess just any final thoughts you'd like to share with us about what we should be thinking going forward when we all buy your book and read it, of course.
I love that question. I think of Sarduy as a playful, brilliant poet, and going forward, if you can take one thing with you, is to sort of remember him not only as a novelist, but as someone whose musicality, his love of jokes, his love of dance, his love of food and pleasure can be experienced through song. And so if you can honor him in one way, to enjoy the music of his poetry in Spanish or in English, and to take part in this process of constant deferral of meaning. I will not let you know exactly what this poem is going to mean, but you can take more out of it the more you read it, the more you participate in the act of reading and reading out loud his poems and celebrating his music, the more he will be, the nuptials of his own desire to write and to love and to sing will be remembered. So to celebrate his poetry and take that with you.
That's beautiful. What a beautiful tribute, as is your book. And so congratulations again. If the public could please join me in applauding David's book. Congratulations. We really enjoyed, I know I did, I know we all did, this very wide-ranging discussion on a very complex and important writer, a novelist, poet. And so we just like to remind everybody that if you know people that would be interested in this event and weren't able to attend, this will be put up on our YouTube page. I believe that link was sent out to everybody just a moment ago in the chat. So please spread the word, pass it along, and it'll be made available soon. And so with that, I would just like to thank everybody for attending. Thank you, David, the organizers, everybody who helped get the setup up and running so smoothly. There's the link again in the chat. Thank you very much from the RITM. And yeah, everybody take care, and congratulations again to David for the book and for sharing his thoughts on Sarduy with us.
Thank you, Shawn.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
You bet.